Sometimes the sellers don't know that there's actually a notice that's been sitting on their property for about 20 years about an illegal structure because they didn't check that when they bought the house.
So the push is to get new homeowners into new houses, new land, everything new.
They're trying to make it easier for first homeowners to get into the market. The new Property Law Act is actually the first change to property law in almost 50 years. So that's when we advise them, by the way, this is what you're looking at in terms of rates and water. And by that stage, the buyers are already locked in. So if you don't like that extremely expensive quarterly rates, too bad. That's it. So should the agent mess up, the buyer then has that termination right up until the settlement date. They could potentially lose a sale, the day before settlement just because of this one mistake of not providing the document.
Real estate agent selling in Queensland, what should I be thinking or how should I be tackling this situation? There might be some agents that are caught off guard and have an understanding that they need to put this statement together.
Real estate agents really need to think about, number one.
All right. Firstly, how are you, Vanessa?
Great. How are you?
Good, thanks. So we've got these new mandatory seller disclosures that's going to be coming into Queensland just around the corner. Can you tell us a little bit about it and what it means for those that are looking to sell their houses in the near future?
Okay, so the new Property Law Act has passed, the 2023 Act. It is coming in from the 1st of August this year. So I think the main thing from the new Property Law Act is the seller's disclosure, as we've discussed probably 1,000 times now, but...
Yeah, well, it's big changes. It's big changes for the whole state, and it's going to change really the process and I think a lot of the culture around selling, right? So I think what we've discussed is it's something that's actually taking in effect in other states in Australia, and Queensland's a little bit behind, I think, when it comes to having these contracts a little bit more robust and with more information and details prior to the property going onto the market. So getting this seller disclosure laws up to date, it might be strange for people in Queensland, but it's something that's already happening around the country.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so the new Property Law Act, it's actually the first change to property law in almost 50 years. So our process in Queensland has been very different to the other states for quite a long time. So everyone else in the industry, this is the first time we've ever had this change. So going to be a huge curveball for us, for sure. So the main difference with the seller's disclosure is that from the 1st of August, the sellers have to make disclosure about the property, about those main items that they don't at the moment. So at the moment in Queensland, it's buyer beware. When buying a property, the seller just gives you a limited amount of information, and it's really up to the buyer to do their due diligence and make sure there's no hidden surprises. So the biggest change from 1st of August is that the seller, they receive more of the onus to actually disclose more things about the property and what the buyer should be aware of. So yeah, it's shifting now back to the seller a little bit, which is, I think, a bit overdue for our state. Other states are already doing that. So I think it's a bit time to even the odds, I guess, buyers and sellers.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, it's making sure that before the property is on the market or before a buyer puts an offer on the property, that the buyer's got all of the details of the property and is aware if there are any issues hidden around the corner.
Correct.
Is that right?
Correct. So
and so what are the kind of issues that might come up that we might see in this disclosure statement? What do sellers now have to provide?
All right. Well, starting from the top, so they have to provide information about the title, which at the moment they kind of do, but they don't have to necessarily disclose a copy of the title or the plan. But from now, they do have to provide that. Any encumbrances on the title, at the moment, buyers have to order that themselves if they want any details about easements or anything that's registered on the title that they're going to be receiving after settlement. So the seller now needs to disclose that as part of the disclosure statement. So the buyer gets all those details from the get-go. So if there's something on the property, the buyer can see it from the very beginning. Oh, there's a big drainage thing down the side of the property. No, don't want it because I can't build on top of that. So whereas you have to do that now after the contract date. So, and you don't have termination rights as long as the seller discloses that at the moment. So it's a big difference now. So that's from the that's just one thing. So your title details, rates and water is another thing. So just levy details, what the buyer's looking at in terms of rates and water levies.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to have that up front so the buyer's aware, because as you know, some of these properties, they've got exorbitant amount of fees on the levies, and it can vary on area to area, but sometimes it can be a bit of a shock for buyers.
Yeah, exactly. Because at the moment in Queensland, by the time we get to unconditional status, that's when we order the rates and water searches. So that's when we advise them, by the way, this is what you're looking at in terms of rates and water. And by that stage, the buyers are already locked in. So if you don't like that extremely expensive quarterly rates, too bad. That's it. That's what you're looking at.
Yeah, it's out of your control at that
So
stage,
it's kind of switching back then to the sellers to say, this is actually what we're currently paying. So then it's more of an idea for the buyers of what they're actually looking at when they're buying this house. You got all these extra expenses.
Yeah. And those fees, they're just getting higher and higher, and it really could be a deal breaker for some people.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really just kind of disclosing that sort of information. Like when it comes to buyers, I would still even recommend that they do their searches just to check for outstanding levies as well, because the sellers don't necessarily need to disclose that on the seller's disclosure statement. So it's a little bit of a juggling act, but yeah, as you said, other states are doing it, so we just have to get on board.
Yep. And what are the other things that we see in the disclosure statement?
So the seller now needs to disclose if the Department of Transport and Main Roads has an interest in the property. So that's something that the buyers currently have to do a search on to check if, the Department of Main Roads is going to acquire their property later on. It's not something that the seller necessarily needs to disclose. So if the buyer doesn't do that search and they buy a property, they find out a couple of years later there's a highway going in next door. So that's something they now need to disclose. So that's a search that has to be added to the disclosure statement. Contaminated land as well, whether the property is listed on the contaminated land register. So again, say most sellers probably wouldn't be aware if they've got a property on the contaminated land register, if they didn't check that when they bought the house. That'll be an interesting one. Body corporate, of course, selling at a body corporate. We have to disclose at the moment anyway with body corporate levies and assets and who the manager is, those sort of, and lot entitlements, that sort of general information on a disclosure statement. I kind of think they're fleshing it out a little bit more because they actually have to provide like an information certificate from the body corporate, and they have to provide a copy of the CMS. So that includes the bylaws and a copy of the plan for the body corporate and common properties. There's a lot more now the seller needs to get together, and if they don't have that information, then that becomes our job or the agent's job to get that information for them.
Okay. And out of all of the disclosures, what do you say would be potentially the most problematic, or what could cause roadblocks with the sale of a property?
I'd say the biggest question at the moment seems to be council and water, because there doesn't seem to be like a clear answer as to what do we do, like what do we need to disclose, because with the disclosure statement, we need to attach prescribed certificates to it. So that would be like search results or a rates notice. So I feel like the biggest roadblock is going to be, does the seller have a rates notice or a recent water notice that we can provide? No. Okay, well, we have to then order that. So we're then subject to, the council or the water providers' turnaround times to get that information back and, provide the clear information to attach to the disclosure statement. So I feel like, turnaround times, obtaining all the information that we need, whether it's from the seller itself or ordering copies of these things, that's going to be the biggest hurdle for us.
Yeah. And from my discussions with agents, there's been occasions where they've got a listing for a property on, let's say a Friday, then they slap it online, have an open house on Saturday, and have their contract ready to go in that situation and hoping to sell it on that weekend. That might not be all agents, but I've certainly had that discussion. And so I guess the concern is this going to slow things down in their process?
It is going to be a different process now. So the Law Society has issued like what they suggest agents now do, because like you said, the agents at the moment, they get their Form 6 back. They get instructed to list the property. Great. They get that back. They put the listing up and, 2 days later, they have an open home. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. Yep. So it is going to be a longer process. So at the moment, the suggestion is that the agent gets the Form 6 back, they then have to start the disclosure statement from that point. So whether they engage a lawyer or, do it themselves, that's at the point where the disclosure statement gets underway. They then now need to get the turnaround time for that disclosure statement. So they need to know when that disclosure statement comes back so they can schedule the open home or the auction or before they start getting buyer interest in. So that's now the process that they need to follow to make sure that that disclosure is ready to go to give to a buyer before they can put an offer in on the property. So yeah, it will be a long process.
Yeah, so it's certainly just going to slow it down for them,
it
right?
will, unfortunately, but it's coming in regardless. So they just have to comply with this new process. It is an extra step now for agents and solicitors and sellers, but it's the way it's going to be.
Okay, so if I'm a real estate agent selling in Queensland, what should I be thinking or how should I be tackling this situation?
So at the moment, obviously, real estate agents really need to think about, number one, how they're going to prepare the disclosures, whether they're going to do it themselves or whether they're going to outsource it. Number two, they need to start looking at educating their sellers as they come in. So I suppose when they're signing up a seller, they've got that engagement period of, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. They need to be obviously keeping in the back of their minds, well, should we find you a buyer in, say, like 60 days to 90 days, you've got these new laws coming in from the 1st of August. So that's potentially going to affect the costs of their sale and finding buyers. So it's going to be a bit more expensive after this time. So it's a bit more education for agents, for their sellers as well. So there's a lot more they need to keep in mind as well.
And from your discussions, do you think a lot of agents will elect to have these disclosure statements and the contracts done by their conveyancing team? Or do you think it's something the agents will continue to do themselves like they currently do contracts?
Well, the conversations I've had with agents so far seems to be a resounding, yes, we're giving it to a conveyancer, because I don't blame them. There is a lot involved in these disclosure statements and there's a lot of information that they're probably not going to know the answer to. The Law Society and REIQ said agents cannot give legal advice. As they're aware, they're not solicitors. So as soon as a seller starts asking them questions saying, what does this mean? Do I need to disclose this? That's legal advice. They can't then say, no, that's fine, you can leave that out, because they're leaving themselves at risk. So I think a lot of agents have realised that and thought, no, I don't want to take that risk on. I'm just going to leave that with the conveyancer to cover those sorts of things.
And when you talk about risks, what are the risks involved in terms of getting these disclosure statements wrong or incorrect or not on time?
So the risk is, the main thing is if a seller does not provide disclosure to a buyer from the 1st of September, they can terminate the contract. The buyer can terminate all the way up until settlement date. So obviously that's a big thing. So should the agent mess up, they don't provide disclosure, the contract's entered into on the 1st of August, the buyer then has that termination right up until the settlement date. So they could potentially lose a sale, the day before settlement just because of this one mistake of not providing the document. The second part of that is the information on the disclosure statement needs to be accurate at the time of giving disclosure. So should there be a material mistake in the disclosure statement, the buyer can terminate the contract up until settlement. Then we get stuck into this argument of what is material. So then it becomes a fight between the lawyers to say, this is the material issue for my buyer and I want out. And then the seller has to agree as to whether they should let them out for something that affects their use of the property. Something like rates and water levies is not material, apparently, says the Law Society. So little details like that is not material. It has to be enough for the buyer to say, this affects my use of the property. I wouldn't have entered into this contract if I knew about it. Those sorts of things. Yes. So if that sort of mistakes on the disclosure, the buyer can still terminate.
Okay. And if the buyer can terminate at that stage, there might be a potential lawsuit involved for the agent.
Potentially, kind of depending on what the loss is. Obviously, I don't really want to go down that road, but so really,
No, nor do we want to find out whether or not a non-disclosure or a incorrect disclosure is going to be considered a material non-disclosure.
Exactly.
So we don't want to even test that. So the idea is get the contracts and disclosure statements as accurate as you can get it. And that way you're kind of protected and the sale can be protected as well.
Make sure the sale is protected, make sure the sale goes through, everyone's happy. We don't want to end up in a big legal stoush halfway through a transaction and lose a buyer and end up with a very unhappy seller.
Yeah. And so is the idea behind this disclosure statement, is it a way to ensure that buyers essentially don't regret their purchases, or what was the main kind of motivation to change things up?
It is. Like I said earlier, I think the main concern is kind of evening up the playing field with sellers and buyers. So it's kind of to remove this buyers beware risk when buying properties in Queensland. So it's just, you sign the contract, that's it. It's up to you to do your own due diligence. If you don't do that due diligence, you take the property as is, and any issues you have, you need to raise it before settlement. After settlement, at the moment, if something goes wrong and you decide, oh, actually, I didn't check this account before settlement, it's too bad. You should have done that as part of your searches. So it is kind of taking that a bit more off the buyers, giving it back to the seller. So a bit more clarity when buying property.
Have you had any personal experiences or cases where this has been an issue in the past, where you might have been acting for a buyer and they didn't know something and they were trying to exit a contract as a result of an issue with the title or something that they weren't aware of when they purchased the property?
Yeah, a lot. That's quite
It's a weekly occurrence.
Which one? Okay. So, for example, I think one that's come up in a few transactions recently where the seller has to disclose if they've received any notices from an authority like a council in relation to the property. Sometimes the sellers don't know that there's actually a notice that's been sitting on their property for about 20 years about an illegal structure because they didn't check that when they bought the house. So they've now gone to sell the house. The buyer's done their proper searches and raised this with the seller saying you have to comply with this notice. So that involves either tear down the structure, which they can't do because the property's under contract, or they then need to pay the thousands of dollars to tens of thousands of dollars to get council approval on that structure. So these are now things that sellers have to think about before selling, whereas at the moment they don't. They put the property up for sale, they sign a contract, they're not even aware that notice is sitting there because they won't ask the question before signing the contract. So that's one thing I can think of. Probably the main thing.
And obviously it causes a lot of stress when it gets to the time of settlement because you're getting close and it's a bit of who's going to make the right move.
So these things more often than not pop up right before settlement when everyone gets their search results back and the buyer says, here we go, you've got a notice sitting on the property you didn't disclose, you have to comply with this notice. The different thing is now with those is that a buyer can now terminate the contract, because I would say that's material enough for, getting council approval on a structure, whether it's a house or something, is going to be a big cost to a buyer.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's certainly going to be an interesting time, and I do think sellers are going to be a little bit confused with this process up front. Is it going to have any extra costs or ramifications for the seller?
Well, in terms of costs, yes, it is going to be an extra cost. So it will be an extra cost to either have the disclosure statement prepared by someone. So whether that be a conveyancer or an agent, that will be an extra cost for them to, number one, get that disclosure statement prepared. There's also going to be the issue of the searches that need to be ordered and provided. So that is now an additional cost for sellers on top of preparing that statement. So extra legal costs potentially, extra agent costs and search costs. So they are looking at a longer process to sell and more expensive.
Okay. So I guess the idea is, look, the seller's going to be making all this money off the sale. They can afford an extra couple $100 and they can pay for the searches and for, those upfront legal costs so that the buyer doesn't have to pay it on their side potentially.
Yeah, exactly. So there are still going to be some searches I would recommend buyers will need to order. Potentially, if it's already been provided by a seller, that is less of a cost for buyers than when it comes time for them to go unconditional. They've already got that information provided. But if there are gaps or, any other concerns regarding the property, it is still, up to the buyer to make their own inquiries in regards to whatever it is they're wanting to look further into. So there is less of a cost for buyers, which is kind of switching across to sellers now, but there will be some searches there.
Okay. So big changes coming up for real estate agents and conveyancers. It's something that everybody needs to kind of get across and have an understanding of before the crossover date of 1 August 2025. In other news, Vanessa, how is your day-to-day practice as a conveyancer going?
Great. Busy. We're still very busy at the moment. So, we're all kind of thinking in the background, okay, we're busy now. Things are going to get much busier from the 1st of August. So it's kind of thinking we're, what do we need to do? What do we need to put in place to get ready for all these big changes from the 1st of August? How are we going to structure our day?
But do you think as well that there's going to be a potential disruption to the pipeline of properties that get sold as these new things start to roll out? Like, as we mentioned, there's going to be delays when it comes to contracts. Could it actually affect the property market if there are such inhibitions in the way?
Potentially, because there are a lot of people I know questioning that at the moment. Is this going to, are we going to see this big jump in sales in the next 2 months so everyone can get in before these laws come in? Is it going to drop off from 1st of August? It's kind of anyone's guess at the moment what's going to happen.
Yeah, you would expect that around the 1st of August, things will really slow down because all of a sudden these new changes have come into place. There might be some agents that are caught off guard and have an understanding that they need to put this statement together. There would also be that backlog of all of the searches that need to be ordered in order to ensure that the property can be listed on the market. So it could be a slow few months, you would say, in Queensland from August till, maybe about November, where everyone's just getting used to the whole process, slow amount of sales, people trying to figure out what's going on, and it could actually have an impact on the property market.
Yeah, I think in those first few months after this starts, everyone might be a bit unsure when, solicitors and agents tell sellers this is what's happening, this is what's going to cost you. They might be, a little bit more hesitant to jump straight into a sale. They might hold off for a little bit, which is going to be interesting because obviously, as you know, interest rates change, they drop. Everyone's saying, more buyers are going to join the market, and then we could potentially end up with less houses on the market as the year goes on. So we're going to end up with more of a supply-demand issue, I think.
And what are the main areas that you are predominantly dealing with? Are there any particular suburbs?
So because we're in North Lakes, the main areas we deal with are, of course, North Lakes, Mango Hill, the Moreton Bay region. So that's our predominant area. We do Brisbane as well, some Sunshine Coast and surrounding areas. So they're most of the properties because that's the agents that we deal with. They sell in those areas.
Okay. And any trends or insights that you can share with us?
Not at the moment, no.
Are there a lot of investors that are buying, or are there a lot more first home owners? Do you think there's going to be, has that been a bit of a trend or a change?
I've found that there are a lot of first home buyers buying vacant land at the moment. Since those stamp duty changes came in on the 1st of May, obviously removing stamp duty for first home owners, I have found they're getting a bit more into the market in the vacant land and building area. So a bit of a upwards trend there, I suppose. Investors, they're still going steadily buying properties in our area. I find they're kind of moving out away from our area a little bit, like the Moreton Bay area, just because of the prices. I think the average price around here is $1 million just for a standard 3 to 4 bedroom house. So they're kind of moving away from our area a little bit. What else? Foreign buyers have been banned for 2 years. So we've seen that drop off. That's kind of it at the moment.
Was that previously a significant portion of buyers, or is it a little bit a non-issue?
Not a lot through my referrers. Like, I don't deal with a lot of investors, but I found obviously a lot of the buyers agents, when they're dealing with investors, if they had foreign buyers, they probably would have lost a lot of clientele there.
Okay. It was interesting what you were saying about the first home buyers going for land packages. So are they just buying land and they're building it themselves, or is it part of a package that they're purchasing?
Part of a package. So depending on who's got the block, if the builders have a reservation of a block in a development, so they're offering packages, up to 700, and making all these amazing offers to first home buyers because they've got no stamp duty now. So they've completely removed that limit for first-time buyers, and as long as it's obviously vacant land that they're building on and or a brand new property, never been lived in. So that's it for stamp duty. They've also got the first homeowners grant up until the 30th of June. So that is currently $30,000, which is halving from the 1st of July, dropping back to $15,000. So the purchase price of the house and land has to be up to $750,000 to access that as well. So I think they were marketing very heavily for people to jump in and grab these amazing offers of house and land up to $750,000 and access all this free stamp duty and government grants.
Is that free stamp duty going to continue past 1 July?
It is, yes. That's in place now. That started from the 1st of May, so that's in place now for good. So no stamp duty as long as it's your first purchase anywhere in the world.
And is there a cap on any of the purchase prices, or is it unlimited?
Unlimited. They took away the cap. As long as it's vacant land.
That's pretty good, isn't it? It's not like that in
No,
other
as
states.
long as it's vacant land that you're building your first home in that you're going to move into. Obviously, a very important principal place of residence. So as long as it's vacant land and or a brand new house that's just been built and never been lived in.
Okay, so the push is to get new homeowners into new houses, new land, everything new.
They're trying to make it easier for first homeowners to get into the market. So, which is great. I think they're offering a bit more incentive for first time buyers that were, starting to get largely shut out of the market. So it's just a little bit of extra help, I think, for those first-time buyers.
So thanks for coming on the show, Vanessa. I think of those insights around the disclosure laws and the current state of the property market has been really informative. And I hope our listeners got a lot out of it. And we hope that we see you again back on the show,
Thank
Vanessa.
you.